History is written by the victors. But what happens to the women who should have won? Every era had them, brilliant, powerful, dangerous women who were erased, imprisoned, forgotten, or deliberately written out of the story. Welcome to History Roadshow. These are their stories. She was the most powerful woman in the world. She ruled an empire that covered a quarter of the globe. Prime ministers came to her in nervous deference. Heads of state wrote to her as equals. Poets called her the mother of nations, and the description was not entirely metaphorical. Her children and grandchildren sat on almost every throne in Europe. And yet, for the last 40 years of her life, the question that whispered through the courts and drawing rooms and satirical magazines of Victorian England was not about any of that. It was simpler and more human, and considerably more scandalous. Who was the man they called her servant? Who was the Scotsman who addressed the Queen of England by her first name, who told her when she was wrong, who kept a loaded revolver under his pillow to protect her while she slept, and whose photograph, when she died, was placed in her left hand and hidden from view with flowers? His name was John Brown. He was the son of a tenant farmer from Aberdeenshire. He had no title, no fortune, no political influence, and no education beyond what a rural Scottish childhood provided. He smoked. He drank. He was blunt to the point of insolence with everyone who crossed him, including the heir to the throne. And Queen Victoria loved him. Deeply, completely, and in a way that the establishment spent decades trying to erase from the historical record. This is their story, and it is one that history has never quite known what to do with. To understand what John Brown meant to Queen Victoria, you have to understand what her life looked like before him. And that requires understanding what she lost on the 14th of December, 1861. Prince Albert died at Windsor Castle at the age of 42. The cause was most likely typhoid fever, though Victoria herself never entirely accepted this diagnosis. She believed the shock of their eldest son Edward's romantic scandal had broken her husband's already fragile health. Whatever the medical truth, the effect on Victoria was immediate and total. She did not merely grieve. She collapsed, in every sense that mattered, into a state of mourning so profound and so absolute that it became, over the following years, a serious political crisis. She withdrew almost entirely from public life. She refused to appear at state occasions. She avoided London. She stopped opening Parliament. She moved between her more private residences, Balmoral in Scotland, Osborne House on the Isle of Wight, Windsor when she had to, and she dressed in black every single day for the remaining 40 years of her life. The newspapers, which had once adored her, began to grow restless. Punch magazine ran cartoons. The public, accustomed to a visible monarchy, started to murmur about whether they were getting value for their taxes from an invisible queen. The woman herself was not, as is sometimes assumed, simply paralysed by grief. She continued to work obsessively, compulsively, for hours every day, reading dispatches, annotating papers, writing letters in a hand that could fill 20 pages before breakfast. But she worked alone. She ate alone. She slept every night with a plaster cast of Albert's hand beside her, and an impression of his face made the evening he died. She ordered his clothes laid out each morning as if he were about to dress. She had water brought to his washstand. She kept his rooms exactly as they had been. Her doctors were worried. Her ministers were worried. Her children, who had their own complicated feelings about a mother who had always been more sovereign than maternal, watched her retreat further from the world each year and didn't know what to do. It was her daughter, Princess Alice, who had the idea. Victoria, Alice had noticed, was always calmer at Balmoral than anywhere else. And at Balmoral, there was a servant whose effect on the Queen's mood was quietly remarkable. His name was John Brown, and he had been leading her pony since Prince Albert was alive. Albert had liked him. Victoria had always been comfortable with him. He knew the land and the Queen, and he had a manner unlike anything she encountered in her daily life. In December of 1864, at Princess Alice's suggestion, John Brown was sent south from Balmoral to Osborne House with Victoria's favourite pony, Loch Nagar, to see if the outdoor air and familiar company might coax the Queen back toward the living. It worked, perhaps more than anyone had anticipated. John Brown was born on the 8th of December 1826, the second of 11 children of a tenant farmer in Craithnerd, Aberdeenshire. It was not a world of drawing rooms and court etiquette. He grew up on open moorland, in a community where people spoke their minds because there was no particular advantage in not doing so, and where physical competence in the saddle, on the hill, in all weathers, was simply expected of a man. He came to Balmoral as a stable boy in 1842, 6 years before Victoria and Albert leased the estate. When the royal family arrived, he worked his way through the outdoor hierarchy with a combination of genuine skill and an indifference to hierarchy that should, by any conventional measure, have been his professional ruin. He was blunt with everyone. He was occasionally drunk. He once gave the future King Edward VII, the Prince of Wales, heir to the throne of the most powerful empire on earth, the rough side of his tongue, to his face, in front of witnesses. He kept his job. More than that, he was promoted. Because Victoria, who spent her days surrounded by people who told her what she wanted to hear, who agreed with everything she said, who approached her with a deference so complete it had become a kind of loneliness, found in John Brown something she had not encountered since Albert died. Someone who told her the truth. Victoria wrote about him in her journals with a candour that later embarrassed her family when editing began. He was, she recorded, so devoted, so simple, so intelligent, so unlike an ordinary servant, and so cheerful and attentive. She described his strong and powerful arm helping her across difficult terrain. She noted his kindness and his judgment with an admiration that went considerably beyond what a monarch conventionally felt for the man who led her pony. By 1865, Brown had been given the permanent title of the Queen's Highland Servant. By 1872, he had been designated an esquire, a gentleman in the formal language of Victorian England, and was receiving a salary of £400 a year. For context, this was more than many army officers earned. It was a level of income that placed him, on paper, in the professional middle class. Victoria had created medals specifically for him. She commissioned his portrait. She dedicated one of her published books to him. The court watched all of this with a mixture of bafflement, resentment, and mounting alarm. Because Brown's position was not merely one of favour, it was one of power. He controlled access to the Queen. He managed her schedule. He decided who she saw and when. He sat outside her door at night. He was, in every practical sense, the most important person in Victoria's daily life, and he had no patience whatsoever for the people who resented it. By 1866, the whispers had become something louder. Punch magazine ran a cartoon. Republican pamphlets circulated that were far more direct than cartoons. A Swiss newspaper went considerably further than it reported, as an apparent fact, that Queen Victoria had secretly married John Brown and was expecting his child. The story was false. The fury with which it was met by the palace was real. The nickname Mrs. Brown attached itself to the Queen and refused to let go. Victoria's own children, 9 of them, scattered across the courts of Europe, made their feelings known. The future Edward VII loathed Browne, with an intensity that was personal as much as political, and Browne reciprocated with equal warmth. On one recorded occasion, Browne made the Prince of Wales wait, not because he had to, because he chose to. And Victoria, when told, took Browne's side. Prime ministers came and went, Gladstone, Disraeli, others, and they all had to navigate Browne as an obstacle. He was the gatekeeper to the Queen, and he was not always cooperative. Gladstone, famously, found Victoria almost impossible to deal with at the best of times. The knowledge that a Scottish gillie had more access to her than her own First Minister was not a situation he found easy to accept. Victoria dismissed all of it. She called the gossip ill-natured, her precise phrase, deployed in a letter when the rumours were raised with her, and she did not change her behaviour by a single degree. Browne continued to address her by her first name. Browne continued to tell her when she was wrong. Browne continued to appear in her journals and her correspondence in language that historians, in the decades since, have found difficult to characterise as anything other than love. Then came the 29th of February 1872. Victoria was returning to Buckingham Palace after a ride through the parks when a 17-year-old named Arthur O'Connor scaled the palace fence, sprinted across the courtyard, and thrust a pistol at her carriage. Whether the weapon was loaded remains disputed. What is not disputed is what happened next. John Browne, who was seated with the Queen, threw himself from the carriage, seized O'Connor, and held him until the police arrived. It was the 5th attempt on Victoria's life. Browne had physically prevented it. The public response was immediate and rapturous. Victoria commissioned 2 medals for him, a gold one and a silver one, both designed specifically for this occasion, and wrote about the incident with a pride and a gratitude that go well beyond what a sovereign conventionally records about a servant. For a brief moment, the mockery stopped. The man they called Mrs. Browne had just saved the Queen's life. Even his enemies in the palace found it difficult to say anything. The question that history has never been able to answer, and which the Royal Archives have never been fully willing to help with, is the simplest one of all. What, exactly, was the relationship between Queen Victoria and John Browne? The evidence for a profound emotional attachment is overwhelming and entirely undisputed. Victoria's own words make it plain. She loved him. She said so in her journals and letters, in language she used for almost no one else after Albert died. When he fell ill, she nursed him herself. When he died, in March of 1883, she wrote, "No one's loss could be heavier. Life will be changed for me again. I feel stranded." The words are almost identical to what she wrote when Albert died. Almost, but not quite. Because what she wrote about Browne contains something additional. A rawness, an unguardedness, a sense that she is writing for herself rather than for posterity. "Who will call me Victoria now?" she is reported to have asked in the immediate aftermath of his death. It is a question that contains an entire relationship. The question of whether there was anything more than emotional attachment has occupied historians for a century and a half, and it shows no signs of being resolved. The evidence is tantalizing, contradictory, and largely circumstantial, because so much of it was deliberately destroyed. On his deathbed in 1872, the Reverend Norman MacLeod, chaplain to Queen Victoria, reportedly confessed to having conducted a marriage ceremony between Victoria and Browne. The confession reached the historical record through 3 intermediaries and cannot be verified. A later report, published in 2006, claimed that a senior member of the royal family had disclosed that documents confirming a marriage had been found in the Windsor archives and destroyed. That report also cannot be verified. What can be verified is this. After Victoria's death, her son, Edward VII, finally, at the age of 59, became king and set about systematically erasing John Brown from the record, with a thoroughness that suggests something more than personal distaste. Photographs were destroyed, busts were smashed. The written records that Victoria had left, journals, letters, and diary entries, were given to her youngest daughter, Princess Beatrice, with instructions to transcribe and edit them before destruction. Beatrice did as she was told. Historians who have worked in the royal archives report being asked to seek approval before quoting material and finding that certain sections had been removed or were unavailable. The life-sized bronze statue that Victoria had commissioned of Brown and placed in the grounds of Balmoral was moved to a remote and obscure part of the estate where it would not be easily found. It is still there. You have to look for it. John Brown died on the 27th of March, 1883, at Windsor Castle. He had been unwell for several days with erysipelas, a skin infection, and had refused, in the manner of a man constitutionally incapable of resting, to take to his bed until it was too late. He was 56 years old. Some historians have noted, not unkindly, that he died of loyalty, that had he allowed himself to be ill, he would have survived. He did not allow himself to be ill. He kept working until he couldn't. Victoria's grief was, by the standards of a woman who knew something about grief, remarkable. She had a life-sized bronze statue of Brown commissioned immediately and placed at Balmoral. She had an inscription written for his gravestone at Crathy Kirkyard, quoting scripture, calling him a devoted and faithful servant. She went to Alfred, Lord Tennyson, the poet laureate, and asked him to write memorial lines. She wrote to his sister-in-law, "He was the best, truest heart that ever beat." She continued to mourn him, quietly and privately, for the remaining 18 years of her life. She continued to carry his photograph in a leather case, in her pocket, wherever she went. She continued to wear, on the third finger of her right hand, a gold ring that had belonged to his mother and that he had given her. When Victoria died on the 22nd of January 1901, she left detailed instructions to her physician, Sir James Reed. These instructions concerned what was to be placed in her coffin. She had given them to Reed rather than to any member of her family she knew. Perhaps her family could not be trusted to carry them out. On one side of her body was placed Albert's dressing gown and a plaster cast of his hand. On the other side was placed a lock of John Brown's hair, several of his letters, and his mother's ring, which she wore on her finger. A photograph of Brown, wrapped in white tissue paper, held in her left hand, was positioned so that flowers could be arranged over it, hiding it from view. The family present at her laying out did not know it was there. History has never quite decided what to make of Queen Victoria and John Brown. The official version, devoted servant, grateful queen, nothing more, has always struggled against the evidence of her own words, her own choices, and the extraordinary lengths to which her family went to make sure that version was the only one that survived. What we know, with certainty, is this. For nearly 20 years, in the loneliest and most isolated period of her life, John Brown was the person who called her by her name, who told her the truth, who sat outside her door, who saved her life, who was given her mother's ring and whose photograph went with her into the ground, hidden under flowers from the family who had spent decades trying to pretend he was merely a servant. Whether that was love, whether it was more than love, whether it was something that Victorian England had no language for, and we are only barely beginning to find words for now, is a question each viewer will answer for themselves. But I would suggest that a woman who hid his photograph in her hand to carry it past the people who resented him had already given her answer. A long time ago. Victoria spent 40 years as the widow of Windsor, but for almost 20 of those years, she was not entirely alone, and the establishment never forgave her for it. If this story has stayed with you, and I think it will, I'd love to know what you think. Was it love? Was it more? Was it something else entirely? Leave your answer in the comments. This is one of those questions where the debate never settles, and I genuinely want to know where you stand. Subscribe to History Roadshow so you never miss a story, because the women history forgot had lives far more complicated and far more extraordinary than the official record was ever prepared to admit. I'll see you in the next one.